Okay, so we've been through this crisis, and there are all sorts of explanatory formats out there. And it's interesting to look at the different genres. One genre is that it's all about human frailty. I mean, Alan Greenspan took refuge in the fact it's human nature, he said, you can't do anything about that. But there's a whole world of explanations that kind of say it's the predatory instincts, it's the instincts for mastery, it's the delusions of investors and the greed and all the rest of it. So there's a whole range of discussion of that. And of course, the more we learn about the daily practices on Wall Street, we kind of figure there's a great deal of truth in all of that. The second genre is that there's institutional failures. The regulators were asleep at the switch. The shadow banking system innovated outside of their purview, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and therefore the institutions have to be reconfigured, and it has to be a global effort by the G20, something of that kind. So we look at the institutional level and say that has failed and that has to be reconfigured. The third genre is to say everybody was obsessed with a false theory. They read too much Hayek and believed in the efficiency of markets, and it's time we actually got back to something like Keynes, or we took seriously Hyman Minsky's theory about the inherent instability of financial activities. So we need to reform our theory, if you like. The next genre is that it has cultural origins. Now, we don't hear that much in the United States, but if you were in Germany and France, many people there would kind of say this is an Anglo-Saxon disease. And it's nothing to do with us. I happened to be in Brazil when it was going on, and Lula was kind of saying, well, first off he was saying, oh, thank God the United States is being disciplined by the equivalent of the IMF. We've been through it 8 times in the last 25 years, and now it's their turn. Fantastic, said Lula, and all the Latin Americans I knew, until it hit them, which it does. And then they kind of changed their tune a little bit. So there's a kind of a way of which it became cultural, and you can see that by the way in which this whole Greek thing is being handled. The way the German press is saying, well, it's the Greek character, it's defects in the Greek character, and there's a lot of rather nasty stuff going on around that, but actually there are some cultural features which have led into it. For instance, the US fascination with home ownership, which is supposedly a deep cultural value. So 68% of US households are homeowners. It's only 22% in Switzerland. Of course, it's a cultural value in the United States that's been supported by the mortgage interest tax deduction, which is a huge subsidy. It's been promoted since the 1930s. Very explicitly in the 1930s, it was built up because the theory was that debt-encumbered homeowners don't go on strike. So all along it's been a kind of a cultural value which has been promoted by kind of political economic processes. But there's a cultural element in this as well. And then there's a kind of notion that there's a failure of policy, and that policy has actually intervened. And there's a funny kind of alliance emerging between the Glenn Beck wing of Fox News and the World Bank, both of whom say the problem is too much regulation of the wrong sort. And the big devil in this is, of course, the way in which the Chinese have been manipulating their currency, which is leading to imbalances. If I wanted to take up my view of this, it would be say, well, actually, I think the mortgage interest rate deduction on housing in the United States warps the housing market, and so if you really want to take that line seriously, you should get rid of that. So there are all of these ways, and all of them have a certain truth. And skilled writers will take one or other of those perspectives and build a story and actually write a very plausible kind of story about this. And I thought to myself, well, what kind of plausible story can I write which is none of the above? Which is one of the things I always think to myself. And it's not hard to do, particularly if you're coming from a Marxist perspective, because, you know, there aren't many people who try to do this analysis from a Marxist perspective, particularly with the long experience I've had of trying to work through Marxian theory and how it works in urban settings and the like. And I was really clued into this by this thing that happened at the London School of Economics about a year and a half ago, when Her Majesty the Queen asked the economists, how come you guys didn't see this thing coming? I mean, she didn't say it exactly that way, but, you know, it's just the sentiment. And they got very upset, and then she actually called the governor of the Bank of England and said, how come you didn't see it coming? And then the British Academy put forward this, got all together, all of these economists, and they came up with this fabulous letter to Her Majesty. And it was, it was actually astonishing. It said, well, you know, many dedicated people, intelligent, smart, spent their lives working on aspects of this thing very, very seriously, but the one thing we missed was systemic risk. And you say, what? And then it went on to talk about a politics of denial and all the rest of it. So I thought, well, you know, systemic risk, you know, I can translate it into the Marxian thing. You're talking about the internal contradictions of capital accumulation. And maybe I should write a thing about the internal contradictions of capital accumulation and try to figure out the role of crises in the whole history of capitalism and what's specific and special about the crisis this time around. And there were two ways in which I thought I would do that. One was to sort of look at what's happened since 1970s to now. And the thesis there is that in many ways the form of this current crisis is dictated very much by the way we came out of the last one. That the problem back in the 1970s was excessive power of labour in relationship to capital. That therefore the way out of the crisis last time was to discipline labour. And we know how that was done. It was done by offshoring, it was done by, you know, Thatcher and Reagan, and it was done by neoliberal doctrine, it was done all kinds of different ways. But by 1985 or 86, the labour question had essentially been solved for capital. It had access to all of the world's labour supplies. Nobody in this particular instance has cited greedy unions as the root of the crisis. Nobody in this instance is saying it has anything to do with excessive power of labour. If anything, it's the excessive power of capital, and in particular the excessive power of finance capital, which is the root of the problem. Now, how did that happen? Well, we've been since the 1970s in a phase of what we call wage repression, that wages have remained stagnant. The share of wages in national income right throughout the OECD countries has steadily fallen. It's even steadily fallen in China, of all places. So that there are less and less being paid out in wages. Well, wages turn out to be also the money which buys goods. So if you diminish wages, then you've got a problem with where's your demand going to come from? And the answer was, well, get out your credit cards. We'll give everybody credit cards. So we'll overcome, if you like, the problem of effective demand by actually pumping up the credit economy. And American households, British households have all roughly tripled their debt over the last 20, 30 years. And a vast amount of that debt, of course, has been within the housing market. Now here too there's something very interesting, which is when you look at the nature of the crisis, everybody talks about the subprime crisis, but nobody interprets it as a crisis of urbanization. But it is a crisis of urbanization. It's a crisis of urban form, which had a lot to do, of course, with the suburbanization of the United States, the continued proliferation of suburbanization, and all that was going into it. And so the property market became the center of crisis formation. Now, this is not the first time that's happened. Since the 1970s, one of the ways in which you solved the labour problem was offshoring. In order to offshore, you needed a new financial architecture, which meant that you needed to reform global financial institutions. And you did that in such a way that everything became very volatile. You know, currencies were moving all over the place. And the volatility has actually contributed to a large number of crises since the 1970s. So we've had hundreds of crises since the 1970s, and many of them have been focused on housing and property development. In the United States, we had a huge savings and loan crisis, and back in this country in 1987, 88, there was a real problem in the housing market. So the Japanese land market crashed in 1990, and Japan hasn't recovered since. In 1992, the Swedish banking system had to be nationalized because of the excessive development in the property market. The Southeast Asian crash in 1997-98 was triggered by excessive property development in Thailand. And you suddenly look around and you see this world since 1970 has been highly volatile. A lot of the money has been flowing into things like housing and property development, and a lot of that has gone bad and gone sour, and you've had these crashes after crashes after crashes. And when you look back and you look at the pattern of crises since the 1970s, you would see the present one, and in this I think Lula is right, that actually, I remember writing in around 2005 that if you looked at the aggregate data of the United States, it should be like Argentina in 2001. And everybody looked at it and said, impossible. But now the Argentinians are kind of saying, yeah, you do look like we were in 2001. The only thing is you haven't had a few revolutions and you haven't thrown out presidents and things like that, which we did. So this is the volatility of the thing, and so there's a long historical pattern here where you see crises forming and dissipating, moving around. Southeast Asian, East and Southeast Asian, moved to Russia, moved to Brazil, moved to Argentina. In fact, it's just, and out of this comes a theory which is very, very important, that capitalism never solves its crisis problems. It moves them around geographically. And what we're seeing right now is a geographical movement of that. Everybody says, well, okay, everything's beginning to recover in the United States, and then Greece goes bang, and everybody goes, what about the pigs, Portuguese, interesting, they call them pigs, Portugal, and Ireland and Greece and Spain, sovereign debt crises. And it's interesting, you had a finance crisis, which is in the financial system. You've sort of half solved that, but at the expense of a sovereign debt crisis. So the way in which the crisis gets manifest, it moves from one place to another. Now, there's a wonderful thing that I learned long, long ago reading Engels on the housing question. When Engels kind of wrote, the bourgeoisie has no solution to the housing problem other than moving the problem around. And I think this is a brilliant image. And I make the same argument about crisis formation. And when you look back, it moves it around. Now, it moves it around in different ways. It moves around geographically. And of course, we see the recovery being uneven geographically. The Chinese roaring along right now, but I'm very concerned about how they're roaring along. They're actually into a huge property boom. Property values in Shanghai doubled last year. And the same thing's been going on a bit in India. In other words, they're getting out of the problem by doing what the United States was doing and getting into it. And a lot of that is debt financed. And there's a peculiar way in which debt financing works. It actually works in terms of both the beginning of the cycle of accumulation and at the end of the cycle of accumulation. And the best way to think of this is simply of the image of the financial institution that lends money to developers to develop tract housing around San Diego, and then lends money to buyers to buy the housing. So they operate on both the supply and demand. And of course that can go on and on and on and on. It has things like that have a Ponzi character. They have this kind of asset building. Now what I did in the book was to talk a little bit about that history, but also to talk theoretically about it. And I tried to argue that actually if you look at the accumulation process of capital, you see a number of limits and a number of barriers. And there's a wonderful language that Marx uses in the Grundrisse, where he talks about the way in which capital cannot abide a limit. It has to turn it into a barrier which it then circumvents or transcends. And then when you look at the accumulation process, you look at where the barriers and limits might lie. And the simple way to look at it is to say, look, the typical circulation process of accumulation goes like this. You start with some money, you go into the market and you buy labour, power and means of production, you put them to work with a given technology and organisational form, and you create a commodity which you then sell for the original money plus a profit. Now, you then take part of the profit and you recapitalise it into an expansion for very interesting reasons, which I probably can't get into here, but that's what you do, you've got to do. Now, there are two things about this. One is there are a number of barrier points in here. How is the money got together in the right place at the right time in the right volume? And that takes financial ingenuity. So the whole history of capitalism has been about financial innovation. And you can go back to the sort of the formation of stock markets. You can go back to all of these things. So it's always been about financial innovation, absolutely essential. And financial innovation has the effect of also empowering the financiers. And the excessive power of the financiers can sometimes, they do get greedy, no question about it. And if you look at financial profits in the United States, they were soaring after 1990. They're going up like this. Profits in manufacturing were coming down like this. And you could see the imbalance. In this country, I think the way in which this country has sided with the City of London against British manufacturing since the 1950s onwards has had very serious implications for the economy of this country. You've actually screwed industry in order to keep, financiers happy. And so you see those tensions, and that all arises because of the power of the financiers. There's then the problem of the labour market. I don't have to go into that, but, back in the 1970s, there was indeed a real problem with the labour market. Not a problem there right now. That's not where the barrier is. There's then a problem in means of production. It's a complicated story there, but behind that lies the question of the limits in nature. Are there limits? Are there natural limits? And people are talking about that now. It comes back. Although it's interesting, that question always comes back when there's a crisis. It came back in 1970s when there was a crisis. Remember limits to growth and all that kind of stuff? It always comes back. And I think one of the reasons it comes back is because whether it's real or not is another interesting question. Whether peak oil is real or not is an interesting question. But capitalists, when there's a real problem, start saying, well, the problem's not me, it's the limits in nature. See, you displace the problem of capitalism by saying it's a natural, it's natural somehow. So there's that problem. Then there's a problem of technologies and organizational form. That continuous innovations in that are absolutely essential to the dynamics of this system. But on the other hand, continuous innovations, particularly when they go very fast, can be very disruptive. So you can get crises forming out of the patterns of technological change, and you can document that historically. Then there is the problem of crises in the labour process, the discipline of labour. Again, back in the 60s and 70s, labour discipline on the shop floor was a real problem. Not a problem anymore. They found docile labour forces all over the place, so it's not really a problem anymore. And then there's a problem of the market. Where's the more going to come from at the end of the day? Where's the more money coming from, the more effective demand? Now, there's an interesting question there, where that extra effective demand is going to come from. And that effective demand, there are various ways in which it could be solved. Historically, you could say, well, actually, it was all the feudal lords who had all that gold, and you could actually, sell stuff to them, and so there was, if you like, a gold reserve, a money reserve in the feudal classes. I mean, there's a bit of that left. I mean, there's a lot of gold in the Vatican, which they may have to sell off to pay for the sins of their priests, but that's another question. But there's not much left there. There's not much feudal residual there. Then there's an outside of the system, which Rosa Luxemburg talked about. There were, in the 19th century, a lot of silver in China, so you get the Indians to grow opium to sell to the Chinese. The silver comes to India, and then the Indians have to pay the silver for the textiles which are imported from Manchester, so you get something of that kind. You can't do that anymore. So the effective demand has to be internalized. That is, the demand has to come from within the system. And the only way that can be is by expanding the system. So that in effect what happens is you mop up yesterday's excess product by tomorrow's expansion. In order to do that, you need credit at the end of the system. So the financiers step in at the end of the system as well. So the financiers start to play this absolutely crucial role in the whole process. Now the result of this is that you have got a system which historically has expanded since 1750, if I can read Madison's data right, at around 2.25% per year compound rate. If you look at all of the general stuff in the financial press and everywhere else, people will say, well, the minimum level of expansion of this system is 3%. Okay, it's better if you get more than that, but if it's less than that, it's getting sluggish and people are having real problems, and of course you get to zero, you're in crisis. So a crisis is defined as lack of growth, lack of the 3% growth. So there's this big struggle to maintain growth, compound growth. Now in 1970, compound growth, given the size of the global economy, meant you had to find new profitable investment opportunities for something like $0.4 trillion. Now if you want to resume 3% compound growth, you've got to find profitable opportunities for $1.5 trillion. In 20 years' time, you're going to need $3 trillion of profitable investment opportunities. Part of the thesis I got going here is that actually we are at an inflection point where compound growth of that sort is no longer really feasible. And actually looking backwards at what's happened since 1970, you would say there are plenty of signs of that since the 1970s. Less and less growth has been about making real things, and more of it has been about asset bubbles and all the rest of it. In other words, you look back at the pattern, people couldn't find anything to invest in that was profitable except investing in, derivatives of insurances on derivatives of insurances. And so you get more and more things of that sort. And you start to get new markets forming, which are fictitious markets. One of the big ones right now is carbon trading. I mean, carbon trading is a ridiculous kind of concept. But on the other hand, we're going to have a big market in it. And already people have been making a bundle out of carbon trading on European markets, and they're going to try and make a bundle even more. So we're going to have so we already see in the past these fictitious markets forming, which are absorbing part of the surplus that couldn't be absorbed in real production. We're going to have more and more and more of that. Put in physical terms, imagine 3% compound growth when capital was constituted by what was physically going on in Manchester, Birmingham, and a few other hot spots in the global economy, say in the 1750s, 1780. Imagine 3% compound growth on everything that's going on in China right now, everything that's going on in Europe, everything that's going on in North America, much of Latin America, Africa, not so much maybe, I mean, physically, it starts to look horrendous. when you start to say 3% compound growth on that. And I think that is the underlying problem. Everybody says we've got to get back to growth. You can't do it. And actually the only way you can do it is by creating fictions that cannot last. And so we're going to get increasing speculative activity. In other words, you can't regulate the financial institutions if you prevent the financial institutions from creating fictitious markets. That is where we're going. That is where we have been going over the last 30 years. And we're going to go there even more after. Now, the result of this is to say, look, I don't think compound growth forever is a possibility. Politically, this means that you need to get a hold of the creation of the surplus. Somehow or other, there has to be social control over the production and utilization of the surplus, which is going to require a completely different form of economy from that is given to us by the capitalist rules of engagement. So we have, actually, any sensible person right now would join an anti-capitalist organization. And you have to. Because otherwise we're going to have the continuation. And notice it's a continuation of all sorts of negative aspects. For instance, the racking up of wealth. You would have thought the crisis would have stopped that. Actually, more billionaires emerged in India last year than ever. They doubled last year. The wealth of the rich, I just read something this morning, in this country has accelerated. Just last year, what happened was the leading hedge fund owners got personal remunerations of $3 billion each in 1 year. Now, I thought it was obscene and insane a few years ago when they got 250 million. But they're now hauling in 3 billion. And as the famous statement, I think it was by Andrew Mellon was way back, in a crisis, he said, assets return to their rightful owners, i.e. him. And that in effect is the plug of the financial world right now. Yeah, the assets are going to return to us. Now that's not a world I want to live in, and if you want to live in it, be my guest. But you've got to start thinking, and what bothers me about academia, and as Laurie mentioned, is I don't see us debating and discussing this. I don't have the solutions. I think I know what the nature of the problem is. And unless we're prepared to have a very broad-based discussion that gets away from, the normal kind of pablum you get in the political campaign and, everything's going to be okay here next year if you vote for me, it's crap. You should know it's crap and say it is. And we have a duty, it seems to me, those of us who are academics and seriously involved in the world, to actually change our mode of thinking. Now, changing the academic mode of thinking is not going to revolutionize anything, but on the other hand, it's a necessary condition for some revolutionary change to occur. It has to occur in many, many different areas. And this seems to me is the main point I would want to make about the book, that crises get moved around, both in terms of their form. It's a financial crisis and an effective demand crisis right now. It gets moved around geographically. Here it's, in Southern California, and now it's in Greece, and after Greece is over, it'll be in Spain, or it'll be in Ireland, or then, my God, you might have a sovereign debt crisis in this country. And what will the politicians say then, poor things? I mean, it's just, so it moves around, and these kinds of ways. And we have to get a grasp on that. And that's, in effect, what I was trying to say is that what I can tell you and show to a considerable degree is how it's moving around, why it's moving around, and what the inherent problems are in it. Well, I've spoken long enough, so let me leave it there. Thanks very much.
I just a couple of things I'd like to raise with you. I don't want to hog this at all, because there are so many people here, and I'm certain you've got so many questions. I'm just interested because we're, of course, in the middle of the election campaign here at the moment. And, of course, it's interesting. I don't know whether you've had a chance to look at the way in which the various candidates and political parties are talking about the economic crisis and talking about the resolution of the economic crisis. It seems to me, just to mention something I just mentioned to you before, the ways in which almost members of the Labour Party have been persistently instructed to refer constantly to the global nature of the economic crisis. It's as though they've all been taken into a room and told that they must say global. But in fact, I mean, this idea that this is something which has affected the entire world and is nothing specifically to do what is going on in the UK, you would like to suggest is really a myth.
Yeah, and beyond that, I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, in Germany, they kind of say, you know, it's made in USA. On the other hand, German industry was booming by exporting to the debt-laden US economy. And they're pretending it has nothing to do with them, when in fact it had everything to do with them. And again and again and again, you'll see people avoiding, you know, dealing with that. And the Greece thing, and actually the Spain thing is particularly interesting. If it wasn't for German investment around the Mediterranean littoral and around all those condominiums that are now standing empty, the Spanish economy would not probably be heading down the chute as it is right now. So in other words, the Germans have played a key role in creating the problems in Greece and the United States. And they say it has nothing to do with them. They were good, honest Germans just working on what they were doing. And you know, but everybody does this. The people in the US do it. They blame China, you know, it's the Chinese, and I'm sure the Chinese blame the US. I mean, so there's a tremendous kind of game being played here, which actually, talk about the politics of denial, is real serious.
But what about the relative insulation of some countries from this? I mean, we all know about Iceland, the way in which Iceland, as it were, went the whole line and became utterly engaged in these spurious forms of investment. But what about countries which somehow managed to escape the worst effects? What was it about the nature of those countries, about their economic policies, which allowed them that degree of insulation?
Well, it varies. I mean, you know, the neoliberal line was not universally adopted. And it is perfectly true that say, Germany did not dismantle its social protections, or Sweden didn't dismantle its social protections in the same way. When the problems arose, they didn't have the need for a stimulus package in the same kind of way. But then there are some very odd things. For instance, I was in Lebanon last summer, and I said, how's the crisis affecting you? And they said, not at all. And I said, well, why not? And they kind of said, well, you know, we have such a huge building program, rebuilding after the Israelis bombed us, that actually we have full employment, and you know, and you kind of go, well, this is bizarre, you know, what are we going to do? Suggest that actually the solution for the United States is to have somebody bomb the United States, and then they can, then they'd have a stimulus program, you know, that might work, you know. But it's so interesting when you go to different places, you find different policy networks, and so there's what I call an uneven geographical development of it, and it's very hard to track. I mean, I would not have expected the crisis to erupt in Greece the way it's done, and the way in which that is now threatening the whole euro, which is actually then going to be troubling for the whole global financial system. I wouldn't have expected that. And there's a lot of unintended consequences and flows and interactions, and the remittances. The fact that in New York, a large number of the domestic servants are from Haiti, the flow of remittances to Haiti has dropped off like crazy. And Haiti is being, you know, it was before the earthquake, it was in dire trouble because of the lack of remittances. Same is happening in places like Kerala in India, which rely on it. And you know, the interconnectedness is there, and you've got to track it all, and it's very difficult to do, particularly if you're only one person who's thinking about it.
One other question, and that was a sort of analytical question about the contemporary situation, but we're talking about the future. I mean, you provide a very dramatic description of neoliberalism and the emphasis upon individuality and personal self-fulfillment and entrepreneurship and all of this. I mean, at a time when you might have thought some sort of collective reaction to the recurrent crisis of capitalism was being demanded, this is the time when neoliberalism appears to have unleashed individuality in a form in which we've never seen it in history before. So there seems almost a paradox there. Where can we look for hope in the idea of some collective response to these recurrent crises when individualism is so rampant?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I found very distressing is some survey data on people who lost their homes in the United States. And the primary source that they blame for it is themselves. They don't blame the system, not at all. But this is the depth of an ideological configuration. And it takes a long time to shake that up. The one cause for hope I have is that if you look back, say in the United States, there was a collapse of 1929. It wasn't until 1933 that you start to see the big collective social movements that kind of say enough is enough, and you start to see immense pressure on Roosevelt to do something like, institute all of those things that we now live with, like Social Security and reforms of the banking system and all the rest of it. And it took about 4 years before that really came to maturation. One of the arguments I make in the book is I think we're in a legitimation crisis. The legitimacy of neoliberal kind of ideology is in question. But nobody knows exactly what to put in its place. And I think there's a searching for what to put in its place. But it's going to take a little while, I think, before, if you like, that legitimation crisis produces a political movement of some kind. At least that's my hope.